All right. Hopefully, we didn't shake off too many people and folks jump right back in to the recorded version. Will, thanks for calling that out. Hey, Matthew, nice to see you. Um, so while people are filing in, yeah, just say hello and good morning to all of you Regenerati out there. It is a beautiful day in Western Massachusetts here. It's really lovely. It's like 65 degrees and just that beginning feeling of maybe a little bit of autumn crispness. So yeah, it's really lovely outside. I'll probably take this most of this space is out from my porch. So lots of exciting things to share. Hey, Timo, nice to see you. Yeah, lots of exciting things to share. As usual, we'll do a little bit of just a brief bit of network news, and then we'll start digging into some of the living conversations. I think some of the things that I'm excited to jam about include a little bit of another go around of conversation about the active inference modeling work that Matthew is doing. I see Ned out there. Maybe we'll get to talk a little bit more about the refi DAO concept and the role of regenerative decentralized science in the work that Regen Network and many around the refi space are doing. And I think there's a connection there between active inferencing and sort of a formal and open and decentralized science and sense making process. So that's a specific conversation that I think will probably take the bulk of our just kind of emergent conversational flow for this Regenerati News Hour. But again, before we get into that, we'll just share a little bit of network news and good things that are moving, and may have a couple of conversations that circle around some of that stuff. So, okay, well, so item number one, and there's going to be a recording, and there's several threads at forum.regen.network about this, is just to remind people that there's a very active conversation about the currency allow list for Regen Network. We're really breaking new ground in the Cosmos ecosystem and maybe beyond. Not an uncommon thing for Regen Network to be the first to be doing something. In this case, we're the first marketplace that's allowing the community to choose multiple different currencies and to sort of debate what currency should be accepted for people to list their eco credits in. And there's a number of different considerations. The community voted to embrace kind of a definition of what we should consider quality and the kind of questions we should be answering. And there are a number of different currency types from different chain denominations that are going to be coming up to vote. And there's an active conversation going on about several of them. USDC from several different sources, euro from several different sources. I've heard some um, mumbling that perhaps Regen itself will be used, or people will be start debating and potentially socializing it as a currency. So I would encourage people who are interested to dig into that. I don't think we'll go in too much deeper unless an audience member really is like, hey, let's double click on that. But that's just one of the things that's moving. Obviously, it's an important thing in preparation for the upcoming marketplace launch, which is happening shortly. The marketplace launch, just let me bring up the latest timelines. So yeah, very exciting. So the marketplace and marketing launch that's going to have the city forest credits, which is the biggest urban city forest credit listing I think ever, is going to be happening somewhere between the 12th and the 16th of this month. So we're just about 2 weeks away from the first marketplace launch. So hopefully we'll have a couple of those currencies on the allow list. And yeah, then there's a sort of rolling set of things moving from there. The Toucan to Regen or Polygon to Regen bridge should be out, audited, ready to go with all of the user interfaces in this first week of October. And then there's going to be, hopefully, NCT Regen pools on Osmosis. And there's some governance processes and other pieces to do before that all comes together, but on around October 18th, so mid-October, that should all be kicking up. So that's some of the news from the ecosystem, just in terms of governance land. And of course, there's also the Cosmos Zero process. A lot of chains are offsetting and awaiting the sort of credits to come online. So just a lot of anticipation and excitement. So I don't know, Dave, do you have any comments or just observations about that kind of news cycle before we dig into the bulk of the conversation here?
Yeah, I mean, I think one really, I think it's been an enlightening conversation, both at the validator level and just, how we consider bringing, which tokens we consider bringing into Regen Network and why, and the pathways and the audiences. So that, there's very specific technical requirements in order to bring over, like, GUSDC or XLR's USDC or even EUR into the ecosystem. And each one, as we're digging into it, and even at the Loa Labs validator perspective, we're like trying to consider how we can, like, in a more comprehensive way, add value. So we don't need, from our perspective, as we're considering like USDC from using Gravity Bridge, we're actually looking to bring over more native Ethereum users, for example, who using auto forwarding, IBC auto forwarding, can really go right from their MetaMask into Regen. And so that was like a consideration we frankly hadn't even thought about until we really dug into the details and we considered all of the other denom options and what would offer, the most comprehensive, layered set of options as we think about onboarding new communities into Regen and the ability to engage with the marketplace. So anyhow, that I've been appreciating the nuance and the and also frankly some of the challenges I think we still have ahead from like a UX perspective, a UI perspective, when it comes to bringing especially non-native crypto users into thinking about how to engage the marketplace. I think a bunch of things came up where we're realizing, okay, we still have some steps here to consider and having better on-ramps into the Regen ecosystem. So anyhow, just some light reflections, but it's been, I really appreciate it. I want to give a big shout out to Ishmael and the Gravity team and the Loa Labs validator team who've all been like, neck deep trying to sort out the best way. And and you'll actually be seeing a Commonwealth proposal here in about 10 minutes that kind of adds on to this conversation.
Awesome. Yeah, and just to sort of tie a bow on this, I think the end goal is really to have community-owned, open source public infrastructure for ecological data claims and a marketplace that's embedded in that social and scientific process of generating understanding about ecological health. Now, in order to do that, we feel very strongly that an application-specific public blockchain is important. So cutting corners and sort of and creating private versions of sense making, of claims, of data analysis, we really feel strongly is actually going to undermine the ability for very concrete things like soil health to be valued, for carbon to be monitored and appropriately valued in the broader ecosystem. So we've made a series of architectural and design decisions that lead us into this place of kind of clunky user experience in shipping the first iteration of the marketplace. Undoubtedly, we want anybody anywhere to be able to access the marketplace from both sides, creating new credits and purchasing credits. However, let's just sort of this beta launch of the marketplace is really going to be crypto native, and the user experience is going to be a little rough and tumble because of the challenges of sort of like cross chain user experience, which is just where the ecosystem is at. So that's sort of my disclaimer about like where we got here. We got here because, or why we got here. We got here because we have our eye as a community on this bigger goal, and so we made some decisions that are leading to a clunky UX experience, but we believe a much fuller data and sense making capability as a community, where we're not going to collapse into sort of siloed, centralized, and profit seeking sense making. And so with that as kind of a transition, I'd love to see if Matthew wants to come up. I see speaker John Nash. I'd also love to jam with you about this, and really anybody else. Ned, if you're interested in jamming, we're all going to be. There's been a bunch of work, and for those of you who have appeared on or have been listening in, you've started to pick up that we've been doing some significant research and development processes around multiple lines of scientific sense making. But one of the ones that's most exciting, and I think least well understood, is active inference modeling and other, I guess, approaching machine learning and artificial intelligence approaches that really are kind of bringing us closer and closer to the original intention of ecological state protocols. So maybe even it's a leap beyond what we're normally referring to as DMRV, or digital monitoring, reporting, and verification, into a much more elegant and sophisticated computer-aided sense-making capability. So, and again, building out the infrastructure so that can sort of be a core part of how eco credits are generated, how they're audited, and how we're eventually even pricing in the utility value, the ecological utility value, the value of an outcome for the biosphere or a specific ecosystem, not just supply and demand. So that's kind of a bit of a sweeping introduction to the topic. Matthew, welcome up. Thanks so much for coming. Excited to jam with you a little bit.
Thanks, Greg. It's really great to be here.
Do you want to just do a quick overview of sort of the two levels? I mean, there's probably more than two levels, but the two levels of work that you're jamming on related to active inference modeling with Regen and Bioforms, Open Earth Foundation, and other collaborators?
Yeah, sure. So I think just to kind of give a 10,000 foot overview for people who haven't heard much about active inference yet at all, active inference is a particular way of modeling systems that was created initially by a physicist and neuroscientist named Carl Friston to model the brain for computational psychiatry. And the interesting thing about this modeling technique is that if you can draw a boundary of causality around almost any system, any system that can perceive the world and act on the world, you can apply this active inference paradigm to model it and try to predict how it will evolve across time, based on a couple other details that we could get into later. And so fundamentally at the moment, the two major lines of work that we're working on, or major lines of research that I'm applying this active inference paradigm to in the regen context, one is essentially soil evolution and soil integrity and health with respect to underlying variables like organic carbon storage, but not just organic carbon storage as a kind of dumb metric, right? Because in theory, if there are many ways of having carbon in soil, but ideally what you want is a healthy metabolism while also increasing that storage capacity. So trying to understand what that looks like, while also being able to use signals from example, the Sentinel-2 satellite network, which Regen Network had done some work in the past using these satellite
spectral band data to try to understand what was going on with the regenerative grazing program. But basically taking some of those models and trying to transform those into this active inference paradigm is something that I'm working on right now, which there's a lot of interesting details and challenges there that we can talk about later. And then along the other line of work with bioforms, there's a lot of evolution going on there, but we've been kind of playing with a couple different cryptoeconomic mechanisms like AMMs or bonding curves or augmented bonding curves, seeing how one of the primary signals that falls out of active inference models, namely something called free energy, variational free energy to be more specific, how that signal can be used potentially as an input into other systems, such that that input can help to shape the behavior and perhaps improve the incentive structure of other systems. On the bioforms front, there's also some other work and an increasing focus towards trying to understand organizations themselves as organisms that can be evaluated and steered or stewarded using this concept of active inference as well. So that might be something else we want to talk about. So that's kind of the high level overview of what's going on.
Awesome. Yeah, I remember early conversations with John and Axel about the concept of starting to monitor a, the Discord and maybe Commonwealth and Twitter of a DAO, and then linking that sort of starting to monitor those data sets and trying to create a causal model for specific behaviors related to maybe a DAO's stated purpose. So, for instance, if Regen Network's stated purpose is increasing the ecological health and evolutionary capacity of the biosphere, say, and maybe we're thinking that that happens through increases in soil health and increases in biodiversity and sort of a healthy carbon cycle outcome, or things like more carbon is being sequestered year on year than is emitted. We would be thinking of metrics like, my understanding is we would be starting to monitor metrics like eco credits, maybe even having a system of active inferencing that is able to give us sort of this nested free energy variation, both on the eco credits as well at the organizational level. So you can start to track this kind of effectiveness. Am I kind of getting close to the vision there that Bioforms is working on?
Yeah, in a lot of ways. I mean, like the initial state or the initial process is kind of because I was, like I mentioned earlier, we have this through kind of the lens of an organism. You have to start by beginning. There's a few things you need as like a minimal necessary requirement to start developing an active inference model. One of those is an idea of how the kind of sense, or like, first of all, you need to know what you can perceive. So what are your senses? And then you need to have some idea of how those senses relate to the underlying states that you desire in the world. And then in addition to that, that's called a likelihood matrix or tensor. But in addition to that, you need basically an underlying idea of how, or a theory of how the world, those states evolve over time, kind of unrelated to your sense data. And then you need preferences. So you need to have.
Can you give example of a type of theory? Like the theory would be that, if a ton of carbon is worth $100,
Yeah,
then
let me give you an example. You could basically say something along the lines of, let's stick with soil health, right? In terms of soil health, in terms of the way that those states evolve over time, you could perhaps hypothesize something along the lines of, in the simplest form, if the soil is in an unhealthy condition, it's more likely to be in an unhealthy condition at the next point in time than it is to be in a healthy condition at the next point in time. Or if it is in a healthy condition, it is in a more likely state to be healthy in the next point in time than it is at this current point in time. And then in between those two states, there might be a sort of low probability valley of sorts. So it's kind of, getting from high to low or low to high might be, it requires some sort of causal interference, like some sort of causality, some sort of intervention or some sort of action in the environment, transitioning those environments from one state to another. So from good to bad would be
the
ecological
transition,
integration, and from bad to good would be something like regenerative agriculture, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So there's sort of in order to improve from healthy to unhealthy, the theory would go, and this would be sort of there would be support. You could support this or discount this holistic managed grazing, for instance, can be responsible for making that change of state from unhealthy to healthy.
Yeah, exactly. And that's like the lowest resolution image. And the interesting question of what I'm working on at the moment is how to actually model that and how to accomplish that. And there are a number of ways of attempting that. One of the cool things about active inference is that it can also be used as a tool for model development because you can take a number of models in terms of, they're called generative models, which basically means a statistical hypothesis about how reality works. You can take a number of them and then you can throw the sense data that you're getting, so like the satellite data or the soil sample data that Regen has. And then there's this metric that I was talking about earlier, which is this free energy metric, which kind of gives you a sense of how much uncertainty you have in the system with respect to what you are seeing relative to what you think the world's causal structure looks like. So those different models, those different hypotheses, and to the degree those hypotheses are actually closer to what's going on, that free energy level will be able to use less data and more quickly reduce over time. So you can actually use it as almost like a compass or an indicator that can lead you towards better hypotheses of the underlying causal structure, which is actually something really useful when it comes to soil science and looking at soil as a holistic structure, because a lot of that synthetic work trying to stitch together a lot of this domain-specific research in terms of different parts of soil biology or soil structure or soil dynamics hasn't yet necessarily been laddered up into the perspective of a quote unquote organism. Some people would even find that very controversial to call soil an organism itself, which is why we've often started calling it just a bioform with respect to bioform labs, which is has certain properties like an organism, but steps on less toes in terms of the definition.
You're muted, Gregory.
Yeah, sorry about that. I was just sending a couple invites for folks that I thought could. So I was in in my DMs inviting folks in the audience if they would like to come and dialogue. So sort of there's a couple of different branches here that I think are interesting to just kind of like go into deeper dialogue around. One is the concretely how this active inferencing approach might land specifically into creating eco-crediting methodologies, right? And I think there's a couple of dimensions to that. One of them is that I'm curious about. One of them is how are we thinking? What are the things that need to exist on chain, the entities and processes that need to exist on chain for a group that would like to be using an active inference model to help generate an eco credit? What needs to exist? What needs to be true? How is this going to be informing future generations of Regen Ledger?
Yeah, definitely. So, one of the really cool things about the way that active inference was developed is that it's what is called a normative theory. So instead of it being just ad hoc from a bunch of different data sources, it has a perspective. And the interesting thing about that perspective is it actually allows for pretty elegant integration of many different models using active inference from many different and also many different data sources. So like those perceptions that I was talking about earlier, you can imagine, so if you really want to have a good measure of something, so if you're talking about an eco credit, you want to have a really deep and provable understanding that you are able to, that your evaluation of a given ecology actually has predictive validity. Like that would be the ultimate scientific metric when it comes to the quality of a given piece of or a given ecology and the stewardship of that ecology. But obviously over time you want to be able to do that incrementally. You want to refine your model, and you also want to increasingly bring online new data sources. So either from institutions and informal structures, kind of like the satellite data we've been talking about, or Gregory, I know that you've been interested in other kinds of processes that are more inclusive of people who are not associated with institutions, who might just be interested in regenerative agriculture, who might want to start doing some no-till soil building on their local property or in a bioregion as a community. How would it be possible to get data from those individuals such that it could formally ladder up into a model that actually takes advantage of that increased perceptual surface area, let's say? And the cool thing about active inference is it's exactly that kind of platform. And so the long vision for this would be having a core model that increasingly evolves, understands more, can predict more about different ecological environments and also different scales within those environments, and take advantage of everyone who wants or wishes to or can interact with it by giving data or helping to evaluate what that model should look like. So it's a really flexible and powerful model in that way, and that's kind of the long-term vision, I would think, in terms of how it relates to developing kind of auditing or auditing mechanisms or models that can be used as validation of credits.
Right. So in the future, as this continues to evolve, we may have something like a Regen Network, what we used to refer to, and I think maybe should refer to it again, as an ecological state protocol. That is to say, a predictive model about ecological state that is essentially leveraged, used, and is built over time by the community. So it gets sort of more and more refined. The more that it's used, the more that it's fed data, the more that it's corrected, the higher resolution it gets in order to create sort of multiple pathways for people to be generating eco credits from multiple different ecosystems in multiple different ways.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, the cool thing about this is it's not necessarily, it's when you build this model, you can build it flexibly such that it can be applied in different domains, or you can have an agglomeration of specialized models because they can be nested within each other. They can be associated with one another or nested within one another so that you can actually apply it to all different questions that you might have with respect to your organization's concerns. This actually starts to get into some of the ways in which these models can be used to actually not only model the concern of the organization, but also to model the way in which the organization attempts to achieve its goals with respect to that concern. And so this gets a little meta, but you can start to actually internalize or incorporate the people attempting to try to achieve these goals into the model itself, because like I was saying earlier, as long as you can model the system as a set of entities that are able to perceive the world and are pursuing some goals with some idea of how the world works, you can start applying active inference to that, and therefore you can do that with organizations. And that's another line of research along the bioforms the bioforms tack that we're going down that road right now and starting to unpack what that might look like, how you might begin to experiment with that. You mentioned earlier in terms of some of the ideas around Discord. There's this interesting question of, if you're looking at just a text-based interface like Discord, how do you start inferring? You can use other forms of machine learning to begin to understand what people's intentions are, what they're actually communicating in text. Were they communicating an observation? Were they communicating an action they took? You could, in theory, have some sort of formalized systems within organizations to record observations or actions. There's a lot of different options there. So we're looking into that as well and trying to figure out what that would look like.
Cool. And do you mind taking me on a quick tour of the tool? Because I think part of the work that you're leading with bioforms is actually, the sort of through applying active inference modeling to these different levels, soil health, for instance. You're also working on creating a toolkit, right? That sort of are you still building on top of or expanding CAD to sort of the Python libraries to CAD? I think in the early days there was conversations about maybe sort of using the MathWorks toolkit and expanding it. What's going on there, and how might people follow or contribute to the build out of this open source active inference modeling toolkit that's kind of the part of the outcome that Bioforms is leading.
Yeah, definitely. So at the moment, a lot of that work has been just very experimental, and therefore I haven't opened it up on the sort of on the open source development front yet. But that is the goal. I know we're talking about um, having, or I'm going to be at the Regen retreat this basically later this month, and so my goal is to basically have all of those different platforms to at least a point where they can begin to be more easily accepting of open source contributions. A lot of it, like you said, some of it's built on the CAD-CAD, CAD-CAD, which is complex, adaptive, yeah, complex, adaptive, something complex of something computer aided design. In any case, basically it's a system for modeling complex systems based in Python on top of pandas and a bunch of other standard tools in the Python machine learning environment. And that's where we've been doing where I've been doing some of the modeling to try to understand how active inference might interact with other systems in terms of just the sort of the adapters on the underlying active inference library. The underlying active inference library, for anyone who wants to look at that, it's just called PyMDP. So like Pi as in Python, and then MDP, which is a Markov decision process, which is the underlying abstraction or one of the underlying abstractions in active inference. So that's something people could take a look at as well. And then I'm building some surface area around that, some APIs to be able to visualize what's going on inside those linear algebra structures under the hood, as well as trying to figure out what the layer above that underlying sort of bare metal modeling layer should look like with respect to people being able to more rapidly prototype active inference models for whatever their domain of curiosity might be, or to, like, for example, I was talking with people from Digital Gaia the other day, and we're just starting to collaborate there as well. So that's another interesting front of the collaboration. And one of the harder problems is going to also be, whenever we're talking about these kinds of active inference models, creating the statistical model that helps to map perceptions to the actual states in question. So that's where actually a lot of the effort goes in on every single one of these generative models that are used for active inference. And so I know that the team at Digital Gaia is also working on this, perhaps part of like your crediting system. And there's a lot of work to create tools that allow people to easily take their observations or whatever kinds of data in streams or inflows they might have, and map that onto essentially an idea of how likely that is to impact the states they care about. And creating a standard around that is also something that's an open question right now, but getting worked on from a number of angles. So all of that is going on at the moment. I think I will open source a bunch of it later this month, and then solicit contributions from whoever wishes to help along those lines.
Now, some of this is going to be a little bit speculative, I think, but from, and there's a lot of research and development to go. This is still quite, I think, like we have some time as the community starts to understand and contribute and engage with this, I think, very important and compelling approach. And a little bit of speculation, I think, goes a long way to start to envision how this might impact things. So I'm curious, what are your intuitions around how this starts to show up in terms of potentially regenerative crypto economic framework? Like, how are we embedding this type of process in which we can collectively train a community-owned model, essentially, that is, so what are going to be some of the attributes that encourage participation, that reward sort of training, and allow us to create the right incentives between the scientific process of sense making, generating predictive models, and being rigorous around testing those and upgrading them, versus sort of the incentives around the claims or the outcomes themselves. Do you have any intuition around that? It's a pretty big question, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, no, that's a huge question, but an extremely important question. I mean, there's a massive amount of experimentation going on around that, and the question breaks down along many different dimensions. So there's the community dimension, which is one interesting aspect I've been looking into as well, in terms of, I think, people are going to interact with these systems in different ways. One of them, as you mentioned, is the contribution of underlying scientific data. Trying, people who are very interested in that element of this are going to either be in, there are many ways of incentivizing people to interact with it, but also their natural curiosity or care for a given system, and those skills would attract them to contribution in that way. But another really fascinating aspect is using these types of systems to have more, kind of like mimetic signaling, or creating like, so you have a model, right? But most people think of models as something very maybe abstract, cold, removed from what you care about. But actually using these underlying evolving models as, if you can take the underlying states that you're caring about and translate those into something more artistic, something more visual. I mean, I know there's some work going on right now, and some conversations happening around dynamic NFTs, but even if it's not an NFT, just visualizing and having the state of the underlying abstract system be something that is humanized and something that people can relate to in a way that they care more about. So you could imagine, let's say Regen had a given community wanted to understand the general overall state of their ecology, and they were modeling that ecological state in, let's say, a given watershed region, using active inference, and they, a bunch of them were in the future using, Regen's toolkit to be able to incentivize this. If you wanted to understand at a glance, what if you had some artistic representation of, a tree, right? And that tree, the size of the tree, the number of the branches, the health of the leaves, the color, all of those variables were giving you some information about the underlying state of that ecology, right? It's a representation. It's kind of like a totem, if you will. So all those kinds of things are interesting as well for community formation, because we're not just a bunch of rational computers. We also have aesthetic preferences. We like to see things that are beautiful. These can be incorporated into community formation as well. As you asked about, there are all sorts of interesting questions around incentive structures as well, because one of the things that crops up a little bit in active inference is that if you have totally open input to the senses of that structure, and you also start creating incentives for given states, you then create a little bit of a attack vector. So like, you actually give people, you can end up giving people incentives to kind of trick the model, or kind of essentially input sense data that might make the model believe that it's in a particular state that it's not, so that some outcome would be achieved. Like this is one of the things that we were talking about when we were talking about plugging metrics from active inference into something like an AMM, because you end up potentially creating incentives for people to try to mess with your active inference system to try to get some sort of financial side effect. So these are other possible side effects we're looking into and trying to understand what that might look like on the possible negative side. But there are a lot of also really interesting positive aspects as well to that. So stop there. Happy to go into any of those further if you wish.
Yeah, well, yeah. So, sort of just to recap, and I think this is really representative of some emerging, I don't know what we would call it, kind of the emerging vision of many people in the regen movement or the refi movement. So, a couple of key concepts. One is sort of a dynamic, symbolic, digital representation of ecological state. People talk about NFTs, dynamic NFTs related to that, so artistic rendering. I think there's also some really interesting sort of like infographic approaches that create sort of understandable representations of complex systems. So that's one element, one of the primitives probably that's emerging. Another is unitization of ecological benefits, like a carbon credit approach, right? And those two are quite complementary, I think. And then there's so that's another primitive. And then there's the sort of like science and sense making contribution approaches that I think we're still. My sense is there's still the first two are much more clearly articulated in people's minds, and there's sort of more of an emerging consensus around approaches and challenges. They're more clearly specified. But then this, how do we, navigate the perverse incentives on sense making when you're unitizing or creating a community symbol that represents sort of an outcome, a probabilistic outcome, right? So we have this relationship between economic incentives and reality that as you introduce economic incentives, you can create reality distortion. And so there's this specific interaction, which I think you were sort of referring to at the end of your description there, which to me still, I think we have some solid ideas, and there's clearly some places to learn, maybe experiments both in the crypto world and outside of the crypto world. But that to me is a place where I sort of feel like I have the most restraint and caution, and is part of why we've never at Regen tried to create sort of a one regenerative unit to rule them all, but instead tried to be sort of much more specific around specific eco credits from a specific place with specific methodologies, right? Instead of sort of like, hey, we have this omni protocol because of that specific threat vector, because of sort of economic reality distortion and incentives, when what we really want at the end of the day is a direct linkage between the symbolic value, the cultural affirmation of the value of ecological health, right? And then how that flows in and is kind of can align and coordinate actors kind of at a unconscious or subconscious level. So everybody doesn't have to be constantly sort of moralizing or thinking about sort of the fight for ecological health. We can just kind of, go about our business as humans and have a system that we can relax into that is going to result in ecological health.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think all of those dimensions play a huge role. And then another a really interesting aspect of a resilient aspect of active inference when you're talking about how people might attempt to sort of pervert its capacity to see the world is that just like if you started seeing something a little bit strange, using your eyes, you might try to test whether or not maybe it's your left eye, maybe it's your right eye. Maybe you close an eye to see if your actual state, your internal perception of whether that that odd percept, whether it goes away, right? You can do something similar with active inference. Like let's say that you are in a situation where people are attempting to feed this model something that's a lie, right? Well, built into the actual structure, built into that metric of uncertainty, that free energy metric, is the ability to understand if your perceptions, or if they are leading you, or if they are actually contributing to your understanding and your actions, using that information to bring you closer to functional understanding of the world. And if you're not, you can actually test, well, is it this set of senses that are actually quote unquote deluding me, or is it this other set of senses that are quote unquote deluding me? So you can imagine
like scientific checks and balances. So it's sort of like, how do we have like a plurality of models that are available to check each other, that have kind of their own independence, right? That we can access when assigning value or making a decision. It sounds like that's very important.
Yeah,
to
and
think about from the beginning.
at least with respect to this particular modeling framework, there is an underlying perspective on that. And that is the free energy perspective, the free energy minimization perspective. And you can always hold up any set of generative models and sense inputs in light of that free energy reduction perspective and get an answer as to whether or not that subset of the model is helping you to gain a clearer understanding of what you're looking at across time or not. Which is why simultaneously it's very good for hypothesis development and refinement and evolution, as well as it's a really good tool for being able to check your work retrospectively. And you can use that capacity to check your work retrospectively to check certain parts of your system so that in case you were worried about perhaps being attacked, let's say you introduce some new financial incentive in a particular part of the Regen Network, you could monitor that part of Regen Network to see if that free energy level shows increasing volatility. And if it's starting to show increasing volatility, you could then zoom in a little bit further to see like, well, exactly where is that coming from? And exactly how is that affecting the model? And and then that gives you more information that you can feed back into your decision process about whether that's a good or whether that's a desirable or an undesirable incentive mechanism to maintain in the network.
Cool. Very, very interesting. Well, I want to just take a pause here. This has been sort of, I think, a fantastic deep dive. The intention here really, always with Regenerati News Hour, is to have a little bit of a mix between just network news, right, and these deeper conversations in which we're really getting to dig in to some substantive, interesting, living edge conversations. So in this case, I guess this is the second time that we've had a deep conversation about active inference modeling. I think there's going to be some like sort of increasing documentation, opportunities for engagement, and sort of integration of this both in the Regen Network community and larger. So again, to note, the great folks at Digital Gaia, the folks at Open Earth Foundation are all sort of actively building and collaborating on this sort of open source approach. I also would just take a moment to note that there is some, I think, anxiety amongst certain contributors and leaders of this approach around it being captured. I know, I think at least apocryphally, Meta has started paying a lot of attention to active inference modeling in their approach to, I think, sort of like general AI. So I think there's sort of like how do we maintain a system of integrity and openness and integrate these tools so that they're accessible for these purposes, for these regenerative purposes, is just to sort of note that that's a really big question. And to the degree to which the community, like you listeners, can dig in and understand and follow and engage and contribute, it is actually these sorts of complex issues. These are really important for us to build kind of a collective understanding around and a collective engagement around, and be able to, like call bullshit when there's bullshit, contribute to bugs when there's bugs, and create resilience around the application of these systems, right? And so, I just sort of taking a moment to shout out, Matthew, to your work and Bioform's work, and and the body of work that it's been built on. I know there's a really cool active inference study group that exists that people can join and engage with, and then the work that you're doing sort of directly to plug in to this sort of regen approach to refi. I would just sort of encourage folks. There's several validators in the audience. There's people from the foundation. There's land stewards. Sort of people on the journey from degen to regen, refi folks from other ecosystems. So just sort of to shout out to everybody. I would say active public engagement with this specific topic rates very high up on, from my perspective, the priority list in terms of really building a resilient, regenerative sense-making capability, right? Because if we can't root an active and evolving understanding of ecological health and ecological state into how we're unitizing that and incentivizing that, this whole thing is, will never ever succeed. Essentially, it will fail. So the entire gambit, the entire refi gambit, really relies on us nailing the ability to responsibly unitize ecological health outcomes, and that responsible unitization relies on good science, and good science relies on honest and earnest reporting of uncertainty and an embrace of the uncertainty related to claims. And active inference modeling bakes in that understanding of I guess I've heard it referred to as epistemic humility, or we're always understanding that there's uncertainty related, and we're quantifying that uncertainty, reporting it as the free energy variation, and sort of creating the foundation of our approach on that, instead of on, the alternative to that is where you sort of like have the ivory tower ego approach, where legacy institutions are sort of rolling up their sleeves and battling about a particular approach, instead of having an open, transparent scientific approach. So just to sort of end our, get on my soapbox for a brief moment there, and sort of call everybody to, if you have the capability, roll up your sleeves and start getting smart about this and start contributing along with Matthew and others.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an excellent point. One of the really amazing aspects about this modeling technique is that it's not that it's non-capturable. Few things are entirely non-capturable, but it really does become extremely resilient as more people contribute that sensory data, that input data, and also it can be very efficient as you have access to more of those diverse streams of data from around the world, from people who are interested in regenerative agriculture, all around the planet. You actually get really amazing returns to efficiencies of your model. So it becomes less computationally intensive to make sense of the world, the more people who are contributing to this endeavor. And so, while large companies are going to use or try to use any tool they can to gain an advantage, this particular modeling technique and this particular form of machine learning, in many ways, is it doesn't compound those in ways many others do, and it actually benefits from a diverse group of people contributing ideas, energy, perceptions, and underlying insights about how the world works to the model itself. So that's really a great aspect of active inference, and where it really aligns with the ethos of decentralized communities.
How close are we to having, for instance, a first crack at a soil health model that then can be contributed to, and leveraged for eco-crediting, policy decisions, etc.?
Yeah, so I mean, a model or the model, right? That's always an interesting question. So one of my, what I'm doing right now is I'm experimenting with a few little, so along the lines of that recent statement I just made about efficiencies and how data is used, one of the models I'm looking at is literally not taking any perspective at all about how the soil works. It's just taking the satellite data and some of the soil sample data that Regen Network has access to, and seeing what the model says about future states of that system. Another is taking the current sort of correlative data that exists in terms of correlations between underlying soil organic carbon and certain other states that are desired, and then the observations, and just using a sort of correlative approach. And then the third and most speculative and most difficult of those is actually trying to put forward a causal model of how soil might work as a bioform metabolism, so to speak. And so those all do exist in rudimentary form right now. The interesting thing is going to be, the specific answer to your question is, when are they ready for prime time? Well, a lot of that's going to depend on how we observe them to be using their data to reduce free energy over time or gain certainty over time.
And when we feel that that one of these paths is sufficiently resilient or is using that sense data well enough, then it would be ready to take to prime time. But like I'm saying, later this month, I'm going to present some of this at the actual retreat. And at that point, those models could be scaled up to a large amount of sense data input, but they're going to benefit from more people's contribution, more people helping to understand, more scientists coming in, especially with respect to the causal model, more people trying to figure out how all of these perceptions and like satellite data, soil sampling data, potentially imagery that people are taking on their cell phones from other projects Regen might be booting up with respect to certain regenerative agriculture processes that people can contribute to locally. All of that needs to be mapped onto these causal models. And as that happens, the quality of the underlying models will improve, and the ability of those models to use that information to predict the future states of soil health in an increasing diversity of context, because this is context specific. We have to remember to some extent that'll all improve as well. So we're trying to get to that first foothold right now, and I think that's quite near term. But then the journey beyond that first foothold is a continuous one.
Awesome. Super exciting, Matt, and really grateful for you giving us a quick tour of the work that you're doing on active inference modeling. And I couldn't be more excited. I think this, this sort of nested and ever evolving towards more precision and accuracy or certainty approach, and sort of like a formalized approach to that can be leveraged across the community, across the network, across multiple networks, is just enormously exciting. So looking forward to your presentation when we get to spend some time together here in Massachusetts later in the month. We'll definitely share that back to the community as well. Just grateful for you, grateful for everybody out in the audience. There's so many people doing amazing work. It's super great to see all of your avatars and faces. And I guess we'll see everybody next week here on the Regenerati News Hour, and probably in between a little bit. So thank you all for coming, and have a beautiful day.